The rain was coming down hard that Tuesday evening, the kind of rain that soaks you through in seconds. James stood at the kitchen counter, stirring a pot of pasta on the old stove. The apartment was small, but it was home. 2 bedrooms, a tiny living room, and a kitchen that barely fit one person. The paint on the walls was chipping in places, and the carpet had seen better days, but James kept it clean. That's all he could do. His daughter Lily, 10 years old, sat at the small dining table doing her math homework. She had her mother's eyes, dark and thoughtful. His son Tommy, only 7, was building something with his blocks on the living room floor. The blocks were old, some of them chipped, handed down from a neighbor whose kids had grown up. But Tommy didn't care. He could build entire cities with those blocks. James glanced at the clock. 6:30. He'd already worked 8 hours at the warehouse today, lifting boxes, loading trucks, making sure shipments went out on time. His back ached, and his hands were rough and calloused. Tomorrow he'd do it all again, and the day after that. That's what it took to keep food on the table and a roof over their heads. 3 years. That's how long it had been since he'd lost his wife, Rebecca. Cancer took her fast, too fast. One day she was complaining about feeling tired, and 6 months later, she was gone. The medical bills had wiped out their savings. Whatever little they'd managed to put away for emergencies for the kids' future, all of it went to hospitals and treatments that couldn't save her in the end. He shook his head, pushing the memories away. No point dwelling on it. The kids needed dinner, and he needed to stay strong for them. That's when he heard it. A knock at the door, soft, almost hesitant. James frowned. They weren't expecting anyone. Mrs. Chen from next door sometimes came by, but she usually called first. He wiped his hands on a dish towel and walked to the door, glancing through the peephole. A girl stood outside in the hallway. Young, maybe 16 or 17. Her hair was plastered to her face, dripping wet. Her clothes were soaked through, and she was shivering. She looked lost. James opened the door slowly, keeping the chain lock on. "Can I help you?" The girl looked up at him, and he could see the exhaustion in her eyes. "I'm so sorry to bother you," she said, her voice shaking from the cold. "I'm lost, and my phone died. I don't have anywhere to go tonight. I saw your light on and thought maybe. I know this is crazy asking a stranger, but could I please just stay somewhere dry for the night? I can sleep in a hallway or anywhere. I just need to get out of the rain." James stared at her. Every instinct told him this was a bad idea. You don't let strangers into your home, especially when you have kids. Especially in this neighborhood where people kept to themselves and locked their doors tight. But something in her eyes reminded him of Lily. If his daughter was ever lost and scared, he'd hope someone would help her. He glanced back at his kids. Lily had looked up from her homework, curious. Tommy was still playing with his blocks, oblivious. "Please," the girl said again. "I'm not dangerous. I just need help." James made a decision that probably wasn't smart, but felt right. He closed the door, removed the chain, and opened it again. "Come in. You're going to catch pneumonia out there." The girl's eyes widened with relief. "Thank you. Thank you so much. I promise I'll leave first thing in the morning." She stepped inside, and immediately a puddle formed around her shoes. She looked embarrassed. "I'm sorry, I'm getting your floor all wet." "Don't worry about it," James said, closing the door behind her. "Wait here." He went to the tiny bathroom and grabbed a couple of towels. When he came back, Lily was staring at the girl with open curiosity. Tommy had finally noticed something unusual was happening and had stopped playing. "Here," James handed the girl the towels. "Dry off. What's your name?" "Sophie," she said quietly, wrapping a towel around her shoulders. "I'm James. That's my daughter Lily, and my son Tommy." He pointed to each of them. "Are you hurt? Do you need medical attention?" Sophie shook her head. "No, I'm okay. Just cold and wet." James nodded. "Listen, I'm going to be straight with you. I've got 2 kids here, and I don't know you, so I'm taking a risk letting you in. But I can't send you back out in that storm. You can stay tonight, sleep on the couch, but I need you to understand that I'm going to keep my bedroom door locked, and if anything seems off, I'm calling the police. Fair?" Sophie nodded quickly. Fair. I understand completely. I would do the same thing. Thank you for even giving me a chance. There was something about the way she spoke, polite, educated. This wasn't some street kid. Something had happened to her, something that put her on his doorstep in the middle of a rainstorm. Daddy? Who is she? Tommy asked, finally finding his voice. Her name is Sophie, and she's going to stay with us tonight because she needs help, James explained. Remember how we talked about helping people when we can? Tommy nodded slowly, still unsure about this stranger in their home. James turned back to Sophie. Come on, let's get you into some dry clothes. You're about the same size Rebecca was. He paused, the name catching in his throat. My late wife. I kept some of her clothes. Never could bring myself to give them all away. Sophie followed him to his bedroom and he pulled out a box from the closet. Inside were folded shirts, jeans, and sweaters. Simple clothes, but clean and dry. He handed her a sweatshirt and a pair of jeans. The bathroom's right there. You can change and hang your wet clothes over the shower rod. Thank you, Sophie said softly, taking the clothes. While she changed, James went back to the kitchen and added more pasta to the pot. They didn't have much, but they could share. He opened a jar of tomato sauce, the cheap kind from the discount store, and heated it in a small pan. Sophie emerged a few minutes later in Rebecca's old clothes. They fit her well enough. Her hair was still damp, but she'd combed it back with her fingers. She looked more like a regular teenager now, less like someone running from something. Sit down, James said, gesturing to the table. Dinner's almost ready. You don't have to feed me, Sophie protested. You've already done so much. You're in my house, you eat, James said firmly. It's not fancy, just pasta and sauce, but it'll warm you up. They sat around the small table, the four of them. James served the pasta in mismatched bowls. Lily kept sneaking glances at Sophie, clearly bursting with questions but too polite to ask. Tommy was less subtle. Why were you outside in the rain? He asked, his mouth full of pasta. Tommy, don't talk with your mouth full, James corrected gently. Sophie smiled, the first real smile James had seen from her. It's okay. I had a fight with my dad and left home. I thought I could make it to my friend's house, but I got lost. And then it started raining, and my phone died, and I didn't know what to do. You ran away? Lily asked, her eyes wide. Sophie hesitated. Sort of. I was angry and upset, and I just started walking. I didn't really have a plan. James took a bite of his pasta, watching her carefully. There was more to this story, he could tell. The girl was holding something back. But it wasn't his place to pry. People had their reasons for things. Running away doesn't usually fix problems, he said quietly. Whatever you're dealing with, you'll have to face it eventually. Sophie looked down at her bowl. I know. You're right. I just needed some space to think. They ate in silence for a few minutes. The rain continued to pound against the windows, and the old radiator hissed and clanked in the corner. It was warm inside, though. Safe. After dinner, Lily asked if Sophie wanted to see her homework. To James's surprise, Sophie said yes. The two of them sat at the table, and Sophie helped Lily work through a tricky math problem, explaining it in a way that made sense. She was patient and kind, and Lily soaked up the attention. Tommy brought over his blocks and started building something near where they sat. Sophie complimented his tower, and Tommy beamed with pride. James cleaned up the dishes, watching this strange scene unfold in his tiny apartment. A few hours ago, this girl had been a stranger on his doorstep. Now she was sitting at his table, helping his daughter with homework and making his son smile. As the evening wore on, James got the kids ready for bed. He tucked Tommy in first, reading him a short story from a worn library book. Then he checked on Lily, making sure she'd brushed her teeth and was under the covers. When he came back to the living room, Sophie was sitting on the couch looking uncomfortable. Thank you again, she said. You didn't have to do any of this. James grabbed a blanket and a pillow from the closet. Here, it's not much, but the couch isn't terrible. I've fallen asleep on it plenty of times. Sophie took the blanket. It's perfect. James paused at the hallway leading to his bedroom. Sophie, whatever's going on with you and your dad, I hope you work it out. Family's important. I know that better than anyone. Sophie's eyes glistened with tears. I know. I'll call him tomorrow. I promise. James nodded. Good night then. If you need anything, my door's right there, but it'll be locked. I understand. Good night. James went to his room and closed the door, turning the lock. He sat on the edge of his bed, suddenly exhausted. What had he just done? Let a complete stranger stay in his home with his kids? Rebecca would have thought he was crazy. Or maybe she would have done the same thing. She always had a soft heart for people in trouble. He lay down, staring at the ceiling. Tomorrow the girl would be gone and life would go back to normal. Back to the warehouse, back to the struggle, back to just trying to make it through another day. But tonight he'd helped someone who needed it, and maybe that was enough. James woke up the next morning to the sound of his alarm blaring at 5:30. He groaned, hitting the button to silence it. His body ached from yesterday's shift at the warehouse, and he had another one starting at 7. He lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince his tired muscles to move. Then he remembered. The girl, Sophie. He sat up quickly, listening. The apartment was quiet. Too quiet. For a second he panicked, thinking maybe she'd stolen something and run off in the night. But then he heard the faint sound of water running in the kitchen. James unlocked his bedroom door and stepped out into the hallway. The living room looked different. The blanket he'd given Sophie was folded neatly on the couch, the pillow placed on top. The scattered toys that Tommy always left on the floor were picked up and placed in the toy box. Even the cushions on the couch were arranged properly, something that never happened in this house. He walked into the kitchen and stopped in his tracks. Sophie was at the sink, washing the dishes from last night. She'd found the dish soap under the sink and was carefully scrubbing each plate and bowl. The counter was wiped clean and she'd even taken out the trash. You're up early, James said. Sophie jumped, startled. She turned around, her hands still soapy. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to wake you. I just wanted to help a little before I left. You did so much for me, and I felt bad about making extra work. James walked over and turned off the water. You didn't have to do this. I wanted to, Sophie said quietly. It's the least I could do. James noticed something then. In the morning light coming through the small kitchen window, he could see Sophie more clearly. Her clothes from yesterday, now dry and draped over a chair, looked expensive. The fabric was quality, not the kind of thing you'd find at a discount store. And on her wrist was a watch that looked real, not some cheap knockoff. The metal caught the light, gleaming silver, but he didn't say anything about it. Whatever her story was, it was hers to tell. Have you eaten? James asked. Sophie shook her head. I'm okay. I don't want to take your food. Stop that, James said, pulling out a box of cereal from the cabinet. It was the generic brand, the kind that came in a bag instead of a box, but it was all they had. You need to eat something before you go. He poured cereal into 2 bowls and added milk. They sat at the small table and Sophie ate slowly, like she was thinking about something heavy. I need to use your phone, she said after a few minutes, to call my dad, if that's okay. James pulled his phone from his pocket and handed it to her. It was an old model. The screen cracked in one corner, but it worked. Take your time. Sophie took the phone and stood up, walking toward the front door. She stepped out into the hallway, and through the thin walls James could hear her voice, muffled but emotional. He finished his cereal and got up to check on the kids. Lily and Tommy were still asleep, their breathing slow and steady. He had to wake them soon for school, but he let them rest a few more minutes. When he came back to the living room, Sophie was standing by the door holding his phone. Her eyes were red and her cheeks were wet with tears. You okay? James asked. Sophie nodded, wiping her face with her sleeve. Yeah, my dad's coming to get me. He'll be here in about an hour. That's good, James said. I'm glad you worked it out. Sophie handed him back his phone. Can I ask you something? Sure. Why did you help me last night? You didn't know me. I could have been anyone. James thought about it for a moment. Because you needed help, and because I'd hoped someone would do the same for my kids if they were ever in trouble. Sophie's lip trembled. Most people would have just closed the door. Maybe, James said. But I'm not most people, and you looked like you really needed somewhere safe to be. Lily stumbled out of her bedroom then, rubbing her eyes. When she saw Sophie, she smiled. "You're still here." "Just for a little bit," Sophie said. "My dad's coming to pick me up soon." Tommy appeared next, his hair sticking up in all directions. He went straight to Sophie and hugged her leg like they were old friends. Sophie laughed, the sound surprising even her. "Good morning to you too, Tommy." James got the kids ready for school, making them breakfast and packing their lunches. Sophie helped without being asked, finding bread for sandwiches and helping Tommy tie his shoes when he got frustrated with the laces. It was strange, having another person in the apartment. It had been just the three of them for so long that James had forgotten what it felt like to have help, to have another adult around. Even if Sophie was still technically a kid herself. Mrs. Chen knocked on the door at 6:45 right on time. She was an older woman from the apartment next door, who watched Lily and Tommy for an hour each morning before their school bus came. James paid her what he could and she'd taken to the kids like they were her own grandchildren. "Good morning," Mrs. Chen said, stepping inside. She noticed Sophie immediately and raised an eyebrow at James. "Long story," James said quietly. "Her dad's coming to get her soon." Mrs. Chen nodded, asking no more questions. She'd lived long enough to know that sometimes people needed help and you didn't need to know all the details. James grabbed his work jacket and his lunch bag. He had to leave now or he'd be late for his shift. He looked at Sophie, feeling odd about leaving her in his apartment with just Mrs. Chen and the kids. "You'll be okay until your dad gets here?" he asked. "Yes," Sophie said. "Thank you again. For everything." James pulled out a scrap of paper and wrote down his phone number. "If you ever need anything or if you just need someone to talk to, you can call me." "Okay?" Sophie took the paper, holding it like it was something precious. "Okay." James said goodbye to his kids, kissing each of them on the forehead. Then he left, closing the door behind him. As he walked down the stairs of the apartment building and out into the cold morning air, he wondered if he'd ever see Sophie again. Probably not. She'd go back to her life and he'd go back to his. Two people from different worlds who'd crossed paths for one night. The warehouse was the same as always. Cold, loud, and exhausting. James spent his shift moving boxes, organizing inventory, and trying not to think about how much his back hurt. His co-workers were good guys, most of them working just as hard to support their families. They didn't talk much. Everyone was too tired. During his lunch break, James sat in the break room eating the sandwich he'd packed. Peanut butter and jelly, same as always. He thought about Sophie, wondered if her dad had picked her up, if she was home safe now. He hoped she'd worked things out with her father. Whatever they'd been fighting about, it couldn't be worth running away. He'd lost Rebecca, knew what it was like to not have that person anymore. You couldn't get that time back. The rest of his shift dragged on. By the time he clocked out at 3:30, every muscle in his body was screaming. But he had to pick up Lily and Tommy from Mrs. Chen's apartment, then figure out dinner, then help with homework. There was no time to rest. When he got back to the apartment building, he climbed the stairs slowly, each step an effort. He unlocked his door and stepped inside, expecting the usual chaos of toys and noise. But the apartment was quiet. Mrs. Chen was sitting on the couch knitting something. Lily and Tommy were at the table, doing their homework without being asked. And everything was clean, really clean. The floors had been swept, the dishes were done, and there was even a pot on the stove with something that smelled amazing. "What happened here?" James asked, confused. Mrs. Chen looked up from her knitting and smiled. "That girl Sophie. After her father picked her up, she asked if she could come back. Said she wanted to do something nice for you. She came back around noon and cleaned your whole apartment. Cooked some soup too. Said it was the least she could do." James walked to the stove and lifted the lid on the pot. Chicken soup. With real vegetables and herbs. Nothing like the canned stuff he usually made. "She was here for 2 hours. Mrs. Chen continued. "Cleaning, cooking, playing with the children. Such a sweet girl. She told me to tell you thank you again." James felt something tight in his chest. Gratitude, maybe, or just the realization that kindness could circle back in unexpected ways. That night, after the kids were in bed and the apartment was quiet again, James sat on the couch with a bowl of Sophie's soup. It was the best thing he'd eaten in months. He thought about the girl who'd shown up on his doorstep, scared and wet and lost. He thought about how sometimes helping someone didn't cost much. A couch, a blanket, a bowl of pasta. Small things that meant the world to someone who needed them. He never expected to hear from Sophie again. She'd go back to her life, wherever that was, and he'd stay here in his small apartment, working his shifts and raising his kids. Their paths had crossed for one night, and that was enough. But 2 weeks later, on a Saturday afternoon, everything changed. James was home with the kids, trying to fix a leaky pipe under the kitchen sink. Water was dripping steadily into a bucket, and he was sprawled on the floor with a wrench, cursing under his breath. Lily was reading a book on the couch, and Tommy was watching cartoons. Then someone knocked on the door. James crawled out from under the sink, his shirt wet and his hands greasy. "Can you get that, Lily?" Lily jumped up and opened the door. Then she froze. Daddy?" she called out, her voice strange. "There's a man here in a really nice suit." James wiped his hands on a towel and walked to the door. Standing in the hallway was a man who looked like he'd stepped out of a magazine. Tall, maybe in his 50s, wearing a suit that probably cost more than James made in 3 months. His shoes were polished to a shine, and his watch caught the light. And next to him was Sophie. She looked different. Her hair was styled, and she wore clean, expensive clothes. But her smile was the same. "Mr. James," the man said, extending his hand. "My name is Richard Ashford. I'm Sophie's father. May I come in?" James shook his hand, feeling completely out of place in his own apartment. His shirt was damp, his hands were still greasy, and this man looked like he belonged in a penthouse, not a run-down apartment building. "Of course," James said, stepping aside. Richard and Sophie came inside. Richard looked around the small apartment, taking in the worn furniture, the patched walls, the toy box overflowing in the corner. But there was no judgment in his eyes. Just something else. Something that looked like respect. "Mr. James," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. "I need to thank you for what you did for my daughter." James glanced at Sophie, who was smiling at Lily and Tommy. "I just gave her a place to stay for the night. It wasn't anything special." Richard's eyes grew wet. It was everything. Sophie had been missing for 3 days. We had the police looking everywhere. I thought I'd lost her. I thought something terrible had happened. And then she called me from your phone. And I knew she was safe. James didn't know what to say. 3 days. Sophie had been gone for 3 days before she showed up at his door. "She told me what you did," Richard continued. "How you let her in, fed her, gave her your late wife's clothes, how you didn't ask for anything in return. Do you know how rare that is? Most people would have closed the door. But you didn't." "I just did what anyone should do," James said quietly. Richard shook his head. "No, most people wouldn't have done what you did. And because of you, I have my daughter back." Sophie came over and hugged James then, and he was so surprised he almost didn't hug her back. "Thank you," she whispered. "You reminded me that there are still good people in the world." Richard cleared his throat. "Mr. James, I'd like to talk to you about something." "May we sit down?" James nodded, and they all sat in the tiny living room. Lily and Tommy watched with wide eyes, sensing something important was happening. Richard leaned forward, his hands clasped together. "I want to repay you for what you did, and before you say no, please hear me out." James opened his mouth to protest, but Richard held up a hand. "I'm a wealthy man, Mr. James. I own Ashford Industries. We're in real estate and investments. And I've learned something over the years. When someone does something truly good, something that changes your life, you don't just say thank you and walk away. You do something about it." James felt uncomfortable. "I don't want your money." "I know you don't," Richard said, "and that's exactly why I want to help you." James sat there on his worn-out couch, feeling completely out of his depth. This man, Richard Ashford, with his expensive suit and his talk about industries and investments, was sitting in his tiny apartment offering to help him. It didn't feel real. "I appreciate the thought," James said carefully, "but I'm doing okay. We manage." Richard glanced around the apartment, at the bucket catching water under the sink, at the cracked linoleum floor, at the old television with the antenna wrapped in foil. His expression wasn't judgmental, just sad. "Mr. James, can I be honest with you?" Richard asked. "Sure." "Sophie told me about her night here. She told me how kind you were, but she also told me about the meal you shared. She said you gave her your portion of pasta because there wasn't enough to go around. She noticed that you went without so she could eat. James felt his face get hot. He hadn't thought Sophie noticed that. He'd just made sure everyone else got fed first. I also know you're working at Morrison Warehouse, Richard continued. I made some calls. Your supervisor told me you're one of the best workers they have, that you never miss a shift, that you work harder than anyone else there. And I know how much they pay. It's not enough for a man raising 2 children on his own. James looked at his kids. Lily was listening to every word, her eyes wide. Tommy had lost interest and gone back to his blocks, but Lily understood what was happening. We're doing fine, James said, but even he could hear how unconvincing it sounded. Sophie spoke up then. James, please just listen to what my dad has to say. You helped me when you didn't have to. Let him help you. Richard pulled out a folder from a briefcase James hadn't noticed him carrying. I'm not just offering you money, although I'm prepared to do that if you need it. What I'm offering is an opportunity. My company has a charitable foundation. We run programs in underprivileged communities, helping families get back on their feet. We need someone to coordinate these programs, someone who understands what it's like to struggle, someone with compassion and integrity. James stared at him. You're offering me a job? Yes. Community outreach coordinator. You'd be working with families who need help, connecting them with resources, organizing donation drives, managing volunteers. The pay is $65,000 a year, with full health benefits, dental, vision, and a retirement plan. The number hit James like a punch to the gut. $65,000. He made $28,000 at the warehouse, not even enough to put anything into savings. I can't do that kind of work, James said, shaking his head. I didn't go to college. I don't have experience with that sort of thing. You have the most important experience, Richard said. You've lived it. You know what it's like to struggle, to worry about every dollar, to work yourself to the bone and still barely make it. That's worth more than any degree. We can train you on the administrative side. What we can't teach is heart, and you have that. James looked at Lily. She was staring at him with hope in her eyes, the kind of hope he hadn't seen since her mother died. He thought about all the things he couldn't give his kids. The school trips they couldn't go on because he couldn't afford them. The toys they wanted but never asked for because they knew money was tight. The clothes they wore until they were too small because new ones weren't in the budget. Why would you do this? James asked quietly. You don't even know me. Richard's eyes got shiny again. Because 3 weeks ago I almost lost the most important thing in my life. My daughter ran away because I was being stubborn and controlling, trying to plan out her entire future without asking what she wanted. She was gone for 3 days, and every minute of those 3 days I died a little inside. I imagined the worst things. And then she called me, and she told me she was safe because a stranger had taken her in. He paused, his voice breaking slightly. Do you know how easily that could have gone wrong? She could have knocked on any door. She could have met someone who would have hurt her. But instead, she found you, a man who put his own family at risk to help a scared girl in the rain. That kind of goodness is rare, Mr. James, and when you find it, you don't ignore it. Sophie moved to sit next to her father. He's right. You saved me, James. Not just from the rain. You reminded me that people can be good, that not everyone wants something from you. You and your kids treated me like a person, not like Richard Ashford's daughter with all the money and connections. Just like a person who needed help. James felt tears building up behind his eyes, but he blinked them back. He hadn't cried since Rebecca's funeral. He couldn't start now. Can I think about it? He asked. Of course, Richard said, standing up. He pulled out a business card and handed it to James. Take all the time you need, but please know that this offer is genuine. I'm not doing this out of pity. I'm doing it because I believe you'd be perfect for this position, and because I want to see good things happen to good people. After Richard and Sophie left, the apartment felt even smaller than usual. James sat on the couch, staring at the business card in his hand. Richard Ashford, CEO, Ashford Industries. There was a phone number and an email address. Daddy? Lily came and sat next to him. Are you going to take the job? I don't know, sweetheart. Why not? It sounds like a good job. James sighed. Because I don't know if I can do it. That kind of work with a big company dealing with important people. I'm just a warehouse worker. Lily was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that broke his heart. Mama would want you to take it. James looked at his daughter, this brave, smart little girl who'd grown up too fast. What makes you say that? Because Mama always said you were the kindest person she ever met. She used to tell me that when I was sad. She said Daddy has the biggest heart in the world. That's what the job is about, right? Being kind and helping people. You already know how to do that. James pulled Lily into a hug, holding her tight. She was right. Rebecca would have told him to take the job. She would have said he was being stubborn and scared, and that scared wasn't a good enough reason to say no. That night, after the kids were asleep, James sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and Richard's business card. He thought about what it would mean to take this job. No more warehouse, no more loading trucks at dawn. No more coming home with his back screaming in pain. Real benefits, so if the kids got sick, he wouldn't panic about the doctor's bills. A salary that would let him save money, maybe even take the kids on a real vacation someday. But it also meant stepping into a world he didn't understand. Rich people, business meetings, probably wearing a suit to work. He only owned one suit, and it was from Rebecca's funeral. He'd probably have to learn how to use a computer beyond the basics. He'd have to talk to people, coordinate things, be professional. The doubts piled up in his mind, each one heavier than the last. But then he thought about Sophie, standing on his doorstep in the rain. He'd been scared that night too, scared of letting a stranger into his home. But he'd done it anyway because it was the right thing to do. Maybe this was the same. Maybe being scared wasn't a reason to say no. He picked up his phone and stared at it for a long time. Then, before he could talk himself out of it, he sent a text to the number on Richard's card. This is James. I'd like to talk more about the position. Thank you for the opportunity. The response came back almost immediately. I'm so glad. Can you come to my office Monday at 10? I'll send a car for you. James stared at the message. A car. Richard was sending a car for him. This was really happening. He texted back, I have to work Monday. Can we make it later, maybe after 5? You don't have to work Monday. Take the day. Consider it a personal day while we discuss your new position. The car will be there at 9:30. James set his phone down, his heart racing. This was real. This was actually happening. He didn't sleep much that night. His mind kept spinning, thinking about all the ways this could go wrong, but also imagining what it could mean if it went right. Lily in new clothes that actually fit. Tommy getting the toys he wanted for his birthday. Maybe even moving to a better apartment, one where the pipes didn't leak and the heat worked properly in winter. The weekend passed in a blur. James told Mrs. Chen what was happening, and she was thrilled. She hugged him and told him it was about time something good happened to him. The kids were excited too, though Tommy didn't really understand what it all meant. Lily understood, though. She kept smiling at him like he'd won the lottery. Monday morning came and James put on his funeral suit. It was a little tight now and the pants were a bit short, but it was all he had. He combed his hair and tried to look presentable. At 9:30 exactly, there was a knock on the door. A driver stood there in a uniform. Mr. James? I'm here to take you to Ashford Industries. James grabbed his jacket and followed the man downstairs. Parked in front of the building was a black town car, sleek and expensive looking. Neighbors were staring out their windows, probably wondering what was going on. The drive downtown took 20 minutes. James sat in the back seat, watching the city change as they drove from his neighborhood to the business district. The buildings got taller, the cars got nicer. The people on the sidewalks wore suits and carried briefcases. The car pulled up in front of a tall glass building. The driver opened James's door, and he stepped out onto the sidewalk feeling completely out of place. Inside, the lobby was all marble and glass. A receptionist smiled at him from behind a huge desk. Mr. James? Mr. Ashford is expecting you. Take the elevator to the 30th floor. James rode the elevator up, watching the numbers climb. His stomach churned with nervousness. When the doors opened, he stepped out into a hallway with thick carpet and expensive-looking art on the walls. A woman in a business suit greeted him. Mr. James, right this way. She led him to a large office at the end of the hall. Richard was sitting behind a massive desk. but he stood up immediately when James entered, coming around to shake his hand. "James, thank you for coming. Please sit." They sat in comfortable chairs by the window, which had a view of the entire city. James could see his neighborhood from here, a cluster of old buildings in the distance. "I'm nervous," James admitted. "I don't know if I belong here." Richard smiled. "That feeling will pass. Let me tell you about the position, and then you can decide if it's right for you." For the next hour, Richard explained the job. The community outreach coordinator would work with families in struggling neighborhoods, connecting them with resources. Food banks, job training programs, educational support for kids, financial counseling. The Ashford Foundation partnered with local organizations to provide these services, and they needed someone to manage it all, someone who could relate to the people they were trying to help. "You'd have an office here," Richard said, "but most of your time would be spent in the communities, meeting with families, understanding their needs, making sure they get the help they need. You'd have a team working with you, people who handle the administrative side. Your job is to be the heart of the operation." James listened, and as Richard talked, something clicked. This wasn't about business meetings and corporate stuff. This was about helping people, about being there for families who were going through what he'd gone through. He could do that. He knew how to do that. "When would I start?" James asked. Richard's face broke into a huge smile. "Does that mean you're saying yes?" James took a deep breath. "Yeah, I'm saying yes." Richard stood up and shook his hand, gripping it firmly. "Welcome to the team. You start next Monday. That gives you a week to settle things at the warehouse and get ready. We'll set you up with everything you need. Laptop, phone, company car for community visits, and your own office." James felt dizzy. A week. In 1 week, his entire life was going to change. "There's one more thing," Richard said. He pulled out an envelope and handed it to James. "This is an advance on your first month's salary, plus a signing bonus. I want you to get yourself some work clothes and anything else you need. Consider it a fresh start." James opened the envelope and saw a check, $5,000. He stared at it, unable to speak. "Is this real?" he finally asked. "It's real," Richard said. "You deserve this, James. You deserve a chance to build a better life for yourself and your kids. And I'm honored to be the one who gets to give you that chance." James walked out of that office building feeling like he was floating. The check was folded carefully in his pocket, pressed against his chest like a secret. $5,000. He'd never had that much money at one time in his entire life. Not even before Rebecca got sick. The driver took him back home, and James walked up the stairs to his apartment in a daze. When he opened the door, Mrs. Chen was there with the kids. They all looked up at him expectantly. "Well?" Lily asked, jumping up from the couch. "Did you take the job?" James nodded, unable to stop the smile spreading across his face. "I took the job." Lily squealed and ran to hug him. Tommy followed, not really understanding but excited because everyone else was excited. Mrs. Chen clapped her hands together, her eyes wet with happy tears. "I knew it," she said. "I knew good things were coming for you." That afternoon, James took the kids to a store they never went to, one of the nicer ones in a better part of town. He let them each pick out a new outfit for school, and he didn't even look at the price tags. Lily chose a dress with flowers on it, and Tommy picked out a shirt with a dinosaur. Then James bought himself 2 suits, 3 dress shirts, and a pair of real dress shoes that didn't have holes in the soles. At the checkout, the total came to $600. James handed over his debit card, the one he'd just deposited half the check into, and waited for it to be declined like usual. But it went through. The cashier handed him the receipt, and James stared at it, still not quite believing this was his life now. The next few days were a whirlwind. James went to the warehouse and gave his 2 weeks' notice. His supervisor was sad to see him go, but happy for him at the same time. "You deserve something better than this place," his supervisor said, shaking his hand. "Good luck out there." His co-workers threw him a small party in the break room on his last day. They'd all chipped in to buy him a card and a cheap watch from the discount store. James was touched by the gesture, even though he knew most of these guys could barely afford to chip in. They were good people, all of them working hard to support their families just like he'd been doing. On Sunday night, the day before he started his new job, James couldn't sleep. He kept getting up and checking his new suit hanging on the door, making sure it was really there. He'd ironed it 3 times already, but he got up and ironed it again just to be sure. At 2 in the morning, he finally gave up on sleep and sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. He thought about Rebecca, wished she could be here to see this. She'd always believed in him more than he believed in himself. She used to say he was capable of anything if he just gave himself a chance. "I'm giving myself a chance," he whispered into the quiet apartment. "I hope I don't mess this up." Monday morning came and James got up at 5 even though he didn't need to be at work until 9. He showered, shaved carefully, and put on his new suit. When he looked at himself in the mirror, he barely recognized the person staring back. He looked professional. He looked like he belonged in an office building. Lily was already awake when he came out of his bedroom. She stared at him with wide eyes. "Daddy, you look so handsome." James smiled and did a little spin. "You think so? You look like a movie star," Tommy added, coming out of his bedroom, rubbing his eyes. Mrs. Chen came over early to watch the kids before show. "Oh." She took one look at James and started crying. "You look wonderful," she said, wiping her eyes. "Rebecca would be so proud." James hugged her, grateful for this woman who'd been like a grandmother to his kids. "Thank you for everything, Mrs. Chen. For all the mornings you've watched them, for all the times you've helped us. I won't forget it. You're going to do great things," she said. "I can feel it." The company car Richard had mentioned turned out to be a simple sedan, practical but nice. It was parked in the building's garage with his name on a reserved spot. James sat in the driver's seat for a minute, just taking it all in. This was his car, for work. He had a parking spot with his name on it. The drive to Ashford Industries felt different when he was behind the wheel instead of in the back of a town car. He was doing this. He was really doing this. At the office, the receptionist greeted him by name. "Good morning, Mr. James. Your office is ready. Ms. Patterson will show you around." The woman who'd greeted him last week appeared and led him through the building. She showed him the break room, the bathrooms, the conference rooms. Then they took the elevator to the 20th floor. "This is the Community Outreach Department," Ms. Patterson explained. "You'll be working with a team of 5 people. They're all excited to meet you." She led him to a corner office. It wasn't huge, but it was bigger than his entire bedroom at home. There was a desk, a computer, a bookshelf, and a window that looked out over the city. On the desk was a nameplate, James Anderson, Community Outreach Coordinator. James touched the nameplate with his finger, making sure it was real. "Mr. Ashford wanted you to have a proper office," Ms. Patterson said. "He said you'd be doing important work and you deserved a good space to do it in." Over the next few hours, James met his team. There was Patricia, who handled the administrative paperwork. David, who managed the volunteer programs. Lisa, who coordinated with partner organizations. Michael, who ran the social media and communication side. And Janet, who handled the financial side of donations and grants. They were all welcoming, and none of them seemed to care that James didn't have a college degree or corporate experience. Patricia told him she'd been homeless once, 10 years ago, and Richard had given her a chance to turn her life around. David had been a recovering addict who'd gone through one of the Ashford Foundation's rehabilitation programs. "Mr. Ashford doesn't just hire credentials," David said. "He hires people who understand what it means to struggle. That's what makes this department special." The first week was overwhelming. James had to learn how to use the computer system, understand the Foundation's programs, meet with community leaders, and start building relationships with the families they were trying to help. But everyone was patient with him, and slowly, he started to find his footing. Richard checked in on him regularly, sometimes just popping his head into the office to see how things were going. "Don't try to learn everything at once," Richard advised. "Trust your instincts. You know what these families need because you've been there. That's your superpower." By the end of the second week, James was starting to feel more confident. He'd visited 3 community centers, met with dozens of families, and started seeing patterns in what people needed. Jobs, childcare, food assistance, educational support for kids. He'd been through all of it, so he knew which resources actually helped and which ones were just bureaucratic dead ends. One afternoon, Richard asked James to come to his office. When James walked in, Sophie was there too. She'd been by the office a few times since James started, sometimes just to say hi, sometimes to volunteer with the youth programs the foundation ran. "I have something to tell you," Richard said, gesturing for James to sit. "And I wanted Sophie here because this affects both of you." James sat down, nervous. Was he getting fired already? Had he messed something up? "Relax. Richard said, reading his expression. This is good news. Sophie is going to college in the fall. She got accepted to 3 different schools and she's chosen to stay local so she can continue volunteering with our foundation. Sophie smiled. I want to study social work. Because of what you showed me, James, I want to help people the way you do. James felt his throat get tight. That's wonderful, Sophie. There's more, Richard said. I'm setting up college funds for your children. Full tuition, room and board. Everything they'll need when the time comes. It's already done. The money is in trust funds that will be available when they turn 18. James's mouth fell open. Richard, you can't do that. That's too much. I can and I did, Richard said firmly. Your children are bright, James, Lily especially. She's going to do amazing things. And I want to make sure money never stands in the way of that. James couldn't speak. He just sat there, overwhelmed by the enormity of what Richard was saying. College, his kids could go to college. They'd never have to worry about student loans or working 3 jobs to afford tuition. They'd have a real shot at a better life. I don't know how to thank you, James finally managed to say. You already have, Richard said. You gave me back my daughter. That's worth more than any amount of money. That evening, James took his kids out for dinner at a real restaurant, not fast food. They sat in a booth, and Lily and Tommy ordered whatever they wanted from the menu without asking how much it cost. When the food came, James watched them eat and laugh, and he felt something he hadn't felt in 3 years. Hope. Real hope. Not the desperate kind that just hopes tomorrow won't be as hard as today, but the kind that looks forward to the future and sees possibilities. Over the next few months, James settled into his new life. He moved the family to a better apartment in a safer neighborhood. 2 bedrooms still, but bigger, with working heat and no leaks. The building had a playground, and Tommy made friends with the other kids in the complex. Lily joined the school's advanced program, something they'd never been able to afford before because it required supplies and fees. She thrived, bringing home report cards full of A's. Tommy started taking karate lessons, burning off his endless energy in a positive way. James's work at the foundation grew. He developed new programs, brought in new partners, and helped hundreds of families get the support they needed. He was good at his job because he understood these people. He'd been exactly where they were, and he could look them in the eye and honestly say, I know how hard this is. Let me help you. Richard became more than just his boss. He became a friend. They had lunch together once a week, and Richard would ask James's advice on foundation programs, genuinely wanting his input. Richard told James stories about building his company, about his own struggles and failures before finding success. Money doesn't make you happy, Richard said one day over lunch. I learned that the hard way. What makes you happy is connection, purpose, knowing you made a difference in someone's life. That's why I love the foundation work more than anything else I do. Sophie visited often. She'd come to the office after her classes, helping with youth programs and mentoring teenagers who reminded her of herself. She and Lily became close, with Sophie tutoring Lily in math and science and encouraging her to think about college. One Saturday, 6 months after James started at the foundation, Richard invited James and the kids to his house for dinner. James had never seen where Richard lived, and when they pulled up to the estate, his jaw dropped. The house was massive, with gates and a long driveway lined with trees. Inside, it was even more impressive, with high ceilings and marble floors and rooms that seemed to go on forever. But what struck James most was how empty it felt. There were expensive paintings on the walls and fancy furniture, but there were no toys scattered around, no kids' drawings on the refrigerator, no signs of the messy, chaotic life that made a house feel like a home. Sophie gave them a tour, and